Bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Estamos en el marco de las Jornadas Monetarias y Bancarias 2020 del Banco Central de la República Argentina. Mi nombre es Germán Feldman, soy economista jefe del Banco Central y en esta actividad también va a participar Ariel Dvoskin, que es gerente principal de estudios económicos en el banco. Randall Wray es profesor de economía en Bard College. Ha enseñado en la Universidad de Missouri, Kansas y en la Universidad de Denver y fue profesor invitado en las universidades de París y Roma La Sapienza. Tiene un doctorado de la Universidad de Washington, donde fue estudiante de J.M. Ha escrito numerosos libros y artículos sobre teoría monetaria y financiera, así como en las áreas de política de pleno empleo y política fiscal. Su investigación actual se centra en ofrecer una crítica de la teoría y política monetaria ortodoxa y en el desarrollo de un enfoque alternativo. Actualmente se encuentra trabajando en la reedición del trabajo del economista J.M. y paralelamente está utilizando su enfoque para analizar la actual crisis financiera mundial. El libro más reciente de Wray es Why Minsky Matters, An Introduction to the Work of a Maverick Economist, 2016. So, please, Professor Wray, the word is yours.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a few years since I spoke before the central bank. I'm going to talk about the transformation of thinking about monetary and fiscal policy. Let's go back to 1985 when I was finishing up my dissertation, which was a critique of orthodox monetary theory and policy. At that time, the dominant view was that the central bank controls the money supply through control over bank reserves. The money supply determines nominal values. Most importantly, it determines the overall price level. The Fisher effect determines the interest rate, and this is determined by the real interest rate, that is the natural rate plus expected inflation. And finally, Milton Friedman's expectations augmented Phillips curve argued that there's no long-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation, although there may be a short-run trade-off that is due to temporary fooling. Let's skip forward to the current day in which the thinking about monetary theory and policy has changed considerably, in large part due to the experience of a global financial crisis. The central bank cannot control the money supply. Money is created endogenously when banks make loans. The central bank then accommodates the demand for reserves. So the deposit multiplier should be read backwards as a divisor. And all of these were adopted by the endogenous money approach beginning in the mid-1980s. The central bank supposedly sets the interest rate through a Taylor rule. Money doesn't determine the price level. The equation of exchange also should be read in reverse. Instead, inflation is determined by a demand gap, as well as backward-looking and forward-looking inflation expectations. Many people hold that monetary policy can work through quantitative effects in addition to through the interest rate. So what happened? The global financial crisis cast doubt on mainstream views about monetary policy. Trillions of dollars, yen, and euros were pumped into economies, and quantitative easing demonstrated that the money multiplier story is false and that central banks can't control the money supply. Quantitative easing increased reserves massively, but that did not increase the rate of growth of the money supply significantly. So the belief is that quantitative easing affects interest rates by changing the term and risk spread, and the resulting increase in reserves is irrelevant. The Fed started paying interest on reserves in the United States because otherwise quantitative easing would have driven the overnight interest rate to zero. So now we're able to obtain a non-zero overnight rate despite large-scale lending and quantitative easing by the central bank. So it's believed that the quantity and price of reserves can be decoupled with the use of a corridor system in which central bank pays interest on reserves and then charges interest on discount window lending. Not only is the quantity of reserves irrelevant for the money supply, it's also largely irrelevant for achieving the overnight interest rate target. And so we also should recognize that the central bank can target long rates simply by announcement, standing ready to buy and sell government bonds at whatever interest rate it wants to maintain. Since the global pandemic, we have also learned that monetary policy cannot reflate the economy and cannot get it out of a recession, although it might inflate asset prices. The Fed has all but admitted that the Phillips curve trade-off between unemployment and inflation doesn't really exist even in the short run. So the Fed has said it's not going to raise interest rates preemptively when the unemployment rate declines, and it's going to average inflation rates so that it doesn't react to what could be temporary bumps upward in measured inflation rates. Where do we go now? So I'm going to summarize a new approach, relatively new approach, to thinking about monetary and fiscal policy that is based on what we call modern money theory. We need a new framework for monetary policy. Central banks should embrace their traditional role of being the banker's bank, acting as a lender of last resort in times of financial crises, and also as the government's bank. The first central banks in the world were founded to operate as the bank for the government. Monetary policy should not try to manage aggregate demand and the business cycle. Central bank independence is limited largely to setting the overnight rate, plus lender of last resort interventions, and possibly some bank regulation depending on the institutional arrangements within each country. Central banks should clarify how they cooperate with treasuries to execute budgeted spending to counter the widespread misunderstanding about how governments actually finance their spending, which always involves the central bank, which really cannot say no to the treasury. So the new framework for fiscal policy would have it take the center stage for ensuring full employment and price stability. Governments that issue non-convertible currencies, and by that I mean don't peg to a foreign currency or to gold, don't face budget constraints like private sector entities do. Most modern governments make payments in their own sovereign currency, and they require tax payments in their own currency. Households and firms are currency users, while the government is the issuer, and we argue that makes a difference. The issuer of a currency cannot run out of it. Government spending and lending creates the currency. So taxes don't really finance government spending. Indeed, the government has to spend the currency into existence or lend it into existence before it can be used to pay taxes. When the government receives tax payments, effectively, the currency is destroyed. When the Fed engaged in its rescue of the global financial system back in 2008 through quantitative easing and lending, that led to the Fed lent and spent $29 trillion, and so he was grilled on television and also in Congress. Is the Fed spending tax money? And Bernanke said, no, it's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account. In other words, the government spends using keystrokes. Now, he was talking about the rescue, clearly, but what he said is also true of all government spending. Wynne Godley, who was at the Levy Institute as my colleague for many years, developed the sectoral balance approach. And we can do this sort of an analysis for any country in the world. I am showing a graph of the US sectoral balances. The important point here is that government deficits by identity have to equal the non-government sector's surpluses. If we look at the graph, we see the US government sector in red almost always below the line, which means it is running deficits. The blue is the US private sector, households and firms taken together, almost always above the line, which means they run surpluses. And the gray is the foreign sector, which since the days of Ronald Reagan has always run current account surpluses against the United States. And you will notice that this is a mirror image. The balances do balance. The US government deficit is equal by identity to the private sector surpluses plus the foreign sector surpluses against the United States. The important point here is to recognize that deficits are endogenously determined by the outcomes of all three sectors. They have to balance. A country with a persistent current account deficit like the United States has to run government deficits to allow its private sector to net save running surpluses. And if anyone wants to argue that we should be reducing the US government's deficit, have to explain to us what that implies for the domestic private sector. Do we want the domestic private sector to run the deficits? Or explain how we're going to get the rest of the world to stop running current account surpluses against the United States. The takeaway point is that deficits are endogenously determined. They're not determined through discretionary policy. And finally, turning to the issue of government borrowing, modern money theory has a different view of government bonds. They're not necessary for financing the sovereign government spending, although they can help the central bank to hit its interest rate targets. So we see bond sales as having more to do with monetary policy than to do with financing the government. If the central bank pays interest on reserves, the government actually doesn't even need to issue bonds for monetary policy purposes, because the central bank can maintain a non-zero overnight interest rate even without selling bonds. With quantitative easing, the central bank buys the bonds that the Treasury has issued, and that makes it pretty clear that the bonds are not needed in order to finance government spending, because it's as if the government never issued the bonds in the first place. And finally, in the aftermath of the pandemic, in the UK, the Bank of England is going to buy bonds directly from the Treasury, which completely eliminates the need to sell those into the private sector. The US has done this on occasion in the past too. There's a fear that government debt will generate high interest rates, supposedly crowding out private sector borrowing. But in reality, interest rates, both short-term and long-term, are, in the case of short-term, or can be in the case of long-term rates, controlled by the central bank. The yield curve is determined by monetary policy, not by fiscal policy. Governments cannot be forced to default on their debt. They may choose to do so. That's exceedingly rare and dangerous to do. Bonds provide the private sector with safe interest-earning assets. This is an additional reason to continue to issue bonds, in addition to possible use in monetary policy. Now, back in January, before the pandemic hit, MMT was in the world, in headlines, in all the major newspapers, and all the central banks and other policy leaders had to come out and announce that they would never follow MMT. Bill Gates said that's some crazy talk. But we weren't really saying anything much different from what Alan Greenspan had said. There's zero probability of default, or what the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which is the monetarist Fed, said, that the government can never become insolvent in its own currency. Back in January 2019, Olivier Blanchard at the American Economic Association annual meetings as the president gave his talk. And he argued that, in this environment of very low interest rates, the issuing more public debt may have very small or even no fiscal costs. And as long as the spending is well planned, the benefits are likely to exceed the costs of further increases of the debt ratio. In November, Blanchard and I both gave testimony at a congressional hearing. And at that time, he said, nominal and real interest rates are likely to remain low for a long time to come. And as long as they're low, essentially deficits are perfectly sustainable. Other economists picked this up after his January speech. Paul Krugman said it's becoming increasingly doubtful whether there's any right time for fiscal austerity, even when you're at full employment. Bernstein, who was the chief economist of Vice President Biden, said austerity has been the most damaging policy mistake in economics in recent years. At our testimony, Congressman Panetta asked Blanchard, what is a healthy debt to GDP ratio? Does 100% scare you? Does 144% scare you? Blanchard refused to give an answer. He says there's no magic number. And admittedly, he was making his comments in the context of low interest rates. And the reason he was arguing this is because with low interest rates, he wasn't worried about the debt service spending getting out of control. In my testimony, I presented data that showed it is the overnight interest rate target in the US called the Fed funds rate that drives debt service spending. And that's what this graph shows, that as long as the Fed funds rate is low and is projected to remain low for many years to come, even with very large budget deficits and a growing debt ratio, the debt service is not going to increase. So let me finish by summarizing the main points of MMT. James Montier, who is in financial markets, says MMT thrashes neoclassical economics. Here are the summary points of MMT. Sovereign government deficits and debt are not scary. Governments spend by issuing their liabilities, currency, reserves, and securities. Taxes create a demand for those government liabilities, which are then redeemed through tax payments. Persistent deficits and rising debt are normal, especially for a country that has a current account deficit. They're largely outside the control of Congress or Parliament because they're endogenously determined. Sovereign government deficits and debt will not create a financial crisis, lead to insolvency, or shut a country out of the bond market. And understanding how government finances work will allow us to reclaim the useful tool of fiscal policy. I think I'm probably out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wray, for this very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you, what do you think about the policy response of central banks and governments, both in central and peripheral economies, to the current COVID-19 crisis?
Well, of course, based on what I just said, it does make a difference whether you are pegging your currency. So if you have pegged your currency, you have constrained your fiscal and policy space. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that nobody should peg their currency, so I want to be clear on that, okay? But you are constraining your fiscal and policy space. You need to maintain your exchange rate, which means you need the inflow of foreign currency reserves to maintain that. If you can't make payments in the foreign currency, then you can be in trouble, and Argentina has some experience with that, I know. So you are very constrained. However, if you have not adopted a peg, then the things I've said are all true. They apply to you. Modern money theory does apply to developing nations as long as they have their own sovereign currency and are not pegging. However, I'm not trying to argue that they would be able to run large current account deficits like the US has done. I'm not trying to claim that they do not face some external constraints and the possibility of greater exchange rate effects of running current account deficits in the case of the US and the other rich developed countries. There is no demonstrable impact of current account deficits on exchange rates because exchange rates are largely determined by capital flows, not by the flows of goods and services. However, smaller developing countries may face external constraints. So to get to a quick conclusion on this, you can always use government spending to put your own domestic resources to fight the pandemic. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to completely ignore the external constraint.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Gray. My question is related to what you have just said. One of the main policy prescriptions of MM theory is precisely the idea that the government should be a sort of employment of last resort. My question is whether this policy could be applied to less developed countries that recurrently face external constraint problems, because every time they grow, they simply need to import capital goods, for instance, because they can't produce them internally.
Yes. Well, of course, as you probably know, Argentina did have a limit guarantee program, the Jefes program, in the early 2000s. We took several trips down to study your program, and we got lots of insights from studying the program. So you're absolutely right. The government can always afford this program in its own currency. So you can always put people. The problem is by paying additional may increase your imports. So the advice I can give is what you want to do is use the program to help develop your and your capacity, provide food, clothing, and shelter for the people who are being employed. And so part of the answer is in-kind payments rather than cash payments as you employ people. And we saw examples of that when we observed the Jefes program. Jefes workers receive some kinds of in-payments, which reduces the danger that it's going to increase your imports. And then also may be able to use the Jefes to develop your export sectors, which will also help to mitigate the negative impacts of increasing imports.
Let me, Professor Wray, ask you a last question. In general, when there's a large crisis like the previous global financial crisis a decade ago or the current COVID-19 crisis, one should expect that this kind of phenomena should have an impact on economic theory and policy prescriptions. Do you think the current crisis might have one of these impacts on the way academia approaches economic problems?
Well, sure, it already has. Okay, it has already shown that the constraints on fiscal policy are not nearly so tight as was believed before. You can increase spending a great deal without causing inflation, without crowding out private spending through rising interest rates, You can still maintain near zero interest rates even as you greatly increase spending. That governments don't run out of money, that bond vigilantes don't limit government's capacity to increase spending. I also think that they've shown that the spending needs to be targeted. So, for example, in the United States, we had checks sent out by the administrator to everybody, almost everybody, and very efficient. Most of the people who leave the check, run out and spend them, they lost their jobs. We could have targeted the spending much more to actually tackle the health problems in the country and responded better to the pandemic itself rather than stimulate the economy by sending checks to everyone. So what MMT has always argued is that too much spending can cause inflation. We need to watch out for that. But also we need to make sure that the spending we do undertake is well to achieve objectives. General pump priming is not the right response in the pandemic or in more normal times. You don't want to just pump up demand. You want to target the spending where it's going to do some good.
Well, thank you very much again, Professor Wray. And we expect that we can have your participation in future events of the bank. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Muchas gracias a todas y todos y los esperamos en la presentación de Daniela Prates.